The citadel hung suspended above the storm-racked planet like a shard of forgotten divinity, its vast underbelly glimmering with engines older than history itself. From its balconies, the world below looked like an endless sea of cloud and lightning, a graveyard for civilizations swallowed by their own ambition. Yet here, in the upper sanctum of Varanth, life persisted in defiance of decay. Within walls of molten glass and breathing metal, the air shimmered with warmth, scented faintly of ash and flowers that glowed with their own subdued radiance. Lady Cerethes of the Ember Line moved through her arboretum in silence. Her steps made no sound against the living floor, a mesh of biosteel veins that pulsed faintly with heat. Around her, the garden sighed, 1,000 blossoms inhaling the trace currents of her presence, sensing the ancient blood that still carried the remnant of dragonfire. The petals of the molten roses unfurled, each glowing with an inner ember that matched the pulse beneath her skin. They were her legacy, her defiance against the dying of her kind. And yet, as she touched one bloom gently, it withered beneath her claws, its light extinguishing as though ashamed to outlast her sorrow. Her reflection in the mirrored glass of the arboretum looked almost human in its melancholy. Scales the color of burnt copper rippled faintly across her temples, vanishing beneath the cascade of black hair. Her eyes, vertical and molten, burned like stars trapped behind glass. No one looking at her would see weakness. No one except herself. They had told her it was a curse of the Ember Line, centuries of power burning too fiercely for life to continue within. No egg would ever harden in her womb, no spark would ignite the next heir of her lineage. The healers called it flame collapse, a withering of the genetic fire that gave dragons their dominion. The scholars said it was evolution's mercy, preventing a species that had already conquered the skies from devouring itself. But none of them had to live with the silence of an empty future. She moved among the rows of dying flora, each plant a symbol of her failing will. The roses once thrived in liquid heat, their roots sunk deep into volcanic soil imported from the world's core. Now, their glow dimmed day by day, no matter how much fire she breathed into their chambers. The air had grown too cold even for dragons. Her attendants, mechanical constructs shaped like winged serpents, watched her in quiet obedience. When one dared to speak, its voice was the purr of an engine tuned for deference. My lady, the garden systems continue to decline. The bioreactors are losing balance. The council suggests. Enough, she said. The word struck the air like a flare. The council suggests nothing I care to hear. It retreated, its optics dimming in apology. Cerethes turned back to the flowers. She remembered when her ancestors' wings had cast shadows over continents, when their fire had been worshipped as sunlight. Now they lived in gilded cages above the storms, their bloodline sterile, their glory preserved only through ceremony and holographs. Her gaze lifted toward the ceiling, where the glass curved into open sky. Beyond it, the cloudscape raged, lightning rolling through the mists like the breath of dead gods. Somewhere below, the human colonies still crawled along the poisoned continents, building and dying in equal measure. Once, dragons had ruled them. Now, they were barely remembered as myths. A faint hum interrupted her thoughts, a sound too mechanical, too grounded for the sacred hush of her garden. She turned. The great doors of the arboretum were parting, their edges glowing as they responded to a command not her own. Into the warm haze stepped a figure small and unarmored, wrapped in a simple coat of dusted synth fiber. The scent of earth clung to him. A rarity in this sterile sky. His hair was the muted gold of sunlit soil, his hands bare, calloused, and carrying the weight of labor. He did not bow. Humans never bowed the right way, but this one had the sense to pause before meeting her gaze. You are out of place, she said, her voice like tempered metal. The lower decks are not permitted entry here. He hesitated, as though searching for words that would not offend. They told me you wanted the garden restored. His voice carried no arrogance, only calm certainty. I'm Elias Marin, horticultural specialist from the southern bioterraces. She almost laughed. A gardener? They sent a gardener to tend a dragon's garden. I was told your flora are dying, he replied evenly. And that nothing you've tried has kept them alive. She stepped closer, the air thickening with her heat. The human did not retreat, though his skin flushed crimson in the rising temperature. And you think you can do better than fire itself? I think fire burns things that need gentler hands, he said. And gardens, my lady, are living things. They don't obey command, they respond to care. His audacity amused her, though she would never show it. You believe your human hands can do what my flame cannot? I believe life wants to live, he said simply. Even here. She studied him then, the way his eyes moved not to her but to the roses, the way his fingers traced the air as though already memorizing the pattern of decay. He was not like the others who came seeking favor or fear. His silence was not submission but focus. When he knelt beside the withered bloom, his movements were reverent, not desperate. Your soil's alive, he murmured. But strangled. The roots are burning themselves out. You've been feeding them with pure thermal energy. Of course, she said, affronted. They are born of fire. He shook his head. Even fire needs air. When he looked up at her, his eyes caught the reflection of her flame, not in fear but curiosity. If you'll permit me, Lady Cerethes, I can show you what I mean. She could have dismissed him, burned him where he stood, or had him cast back into the lower decks. Instead, something in his calmness, the quiet defiance that did not challenge but persisted, stayed her hand. Very well, she said at last, the words leaving a taste of ash on her tongue. You will have 3 days. Impress me, or I will have your ashes feed the roots you wish to save. He nodded once, without fear. 3 days is enough. As she turned away, the molten roses flickered faintly in the corner of her vision. Their embers pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat returning after long silence. She told herself it was a trick of the light, nothing more. But deep beneath the garden floor, the living metal shifted, humming faintly in resonance with a new frequency, something organic, something that did not belong to dragons or their dying fire. Something that began, quietly, to grow. For 3 days the human worked beneath the watchful gaze of the citadel's eternal light. Elias Marin rose before the artificial dawn, when the garden still shimmered with cooling embers, and did not rest until the second moon's reflection quivered across the glass canopy. Lady Cerethes observed from above, her silhouette framed against the red auroras that pulsed in the skies beyond the dome. She had told herself she watched to ensure obedience, but the truth itched deeper. She wanted to understand what this strange creature saw when he looked upon decay and dared to call it potential. He moved without the grandeur of sorcery or the reverence of fear. His tools were crude in her eyes, filament gloves, microseeders, and packets of gray dust that glittered faintly in the air like stardust. Yet when he poured them into the soil, the garden seemed to exhale. He whispered to the vines as he worked, murmuring strings of code under his breath that awakened the nanospore clusters he'd brought from the lower continents. The machines were smaller than cells, half-living programs that wove themselves through the dying roots, translating the language of carbon and chlorophyll into pulses of light. By the end of the first day, the molten roses had ceased their decay. By the second, faint green veins began to thread through their translucent stems, a color the dragons had not seen in centuries. Cerethes descended from her balcony in silence. The scent that met her was new, not the sterile tang of molten soil, but the crisp, fragile fragrance of growth. It stirred something uncomfortably human in her chest. Elias knelt in the center of the garden, adjusting a cluster of sensors shaped like glass petals. His fingers moved with precise gentleness, as though tending to an infant rather than machinery. "What have you done to them?" she asked, her tone colder than she intended. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Not much. The nanospore weaves are doing the real work. They're translating your garden's thermal energy into bioelectrical signals. Basically, I'm teaching your fire how to breathe again." She frowned. "You presume to teach fire?" "Not teach," he said, brushing soil from his hands. "Remind. Energy isn't meant to consume forever. Even stars collapse into something new when they burn out. His words unsettled her. The analogy struck too close to the myth that haunted her bloodline, the prophecy that dragons, being born of flame, would one day burn away their own future. She folded her wings close, their metallic membranes catching the lamplight. You speak like a philosopher, not a gardener. He laughed softly. Maybe that's what gardeners become when there's nothing left to grow. She watched him in silence for a long moment. His humor was strange, quiet but sharp enough to cut through centuries of solemnity. And what drives you, human? You live on a dying planet below the storms. You climb all the way here to tend the garden of a creature that could crush you with a thought. Why? He considered before answering. Because this place shouldn't exist, he said. A citadel of living glass, floating above extinction, filled with flowers that burn instead of wilt. It's the last miracle in the world, and you treat it like a tomb. Her tail flicked in irritation, scattering sparks. You know nothing of this place. Of what we lost. Then tell me, he said simply. No one had ever asked. Not the council, not her attendants, not even her own kin. They all accepted the story of the Ember Line's tragedy as distant legend, not living pain. Yet this fragile being, flesh, bone, and borrowed courage, had the arrogance to listen. Long ago, she said slowly, we shaped worlds from flame. Our hearts burned hotter than stars. Every hatchling was born from an ember taken from its mother's breath. But the more we sought to perfect ourselves, the colder the embers became. We traded instinct for purity, fire for control. One day the egg simply stopped glowing. Elias bowed his head slightly, not in pity but in respect. So your people engineered their own extinction. Her eyes flashed. You speak dangerously. Truth usually does. Silence stretched between them, charged with heat and meaning. The garden's light flickered in rhythm with their heartbeats, as though the very air listened. When she turned to leave, Elias reached into the soil and withdrew a small sphere of glass and light. Within it, tiny motes of fire drifted through a lattice of living code. This, he said, is what I found beneath your roots. Your garden isn't dying, it's evolving. The biometal lattice is trying to create something new, but your constant infusion of raw flame keeps resetting the process. Serathi stepped closer, the glow of the sphere reflecting in her molten eyes. You suggest I am the cause of its decay. I'm saying your power keeps it alive, but not alive enough to change. Maybe it's waiting for you to stop trying so hard to control it. She wanted to snarl, to crush the fragile thing in his hands, to remind him that dragons were not made for humility. Yet the sphere pulsed softly, the same rhythm she'd felt beneath her claws days ago. Life, unbound, imperfect, insistent. Show me, she said. Elias smiled, and together they walked deeper into the arboretum, to where the oldest roots met the cold metallic floor. He placed the sphere upon the soil, murmuring activation sequences that glowed across his skin like fireflies. The ground responded, threads of silver and crimson weaving upward, entwining his fingers. Serathis felt the resonance through the air, a low hum that spoke in frequencies older than language. The roses began to move. Their petals twisted, curling toward Elias's light. One by one, they shed their molten skins, revealing cores of translucent crystal within. The garden brightened until even the shadows retreated. When the light faded, the blooms had changed. No longer molten, no longer dying. They shimmered with soft, greenish gold light, their fragrance unfamiliar and alive. Elias straightened, sweat glistening on his brow. They're breathing again, he said quietly. Not through fire, but through balance. Serathis reached out and touched one of the blossoms. Its warmth was gentle, no searing heat, no unstable energy. Just life, steady and patient. Her throat tightened, her voice softer than she meant it to be. They're beautiful. He turned toward her. So are you, when you're not trying to burn everything that touches you. For a heartbeat, the air stilled. Her gaze met his, and something passed between them, something neither fire nor flesh could define. When she left the garden that night, her steps were unsteady. In her palm she held one of the new blossoms, its faint pulse echoing in her chest. Behind her, Elias remained among the roots, surrounded by the slow whisper of leaves that had begun, impossibly, to sing. And deep beneath the soil, where living metal dreamed in silence, the pulse that had begun days ago grew stronger, synchronized now to two hearts instead of one. The storm came without warning, a monstrous sweep of charged air and turbulent clouds that tore across the upper atmosphere of Varanth. The floating citadel shuddered, its suspension engines whining against the violent currents, metal groaning in protest. Lightning tore across the sky like fractured veins, illuminating the garden in jagged bursts of white and blue. From her balcony, Lady Cerethes watched the chaos with an instinctual tension, wings taut against her back. Storms were not uncommon in these heights, but there was a particular ferocity to this one, as though the skies themselves were testing the citadel's endurance. Elias Marin was already in the garden when the first magnetic wind struck. He moved with a surprising steadiness, balancing on the curved biosteel walkways, hands cradling fragile clusters of newly stabilized blooms. His eyes, bright in the dim emergency light, were focused, unflinching. The dragons of old would have taken to flight in terror or fury. She had expected him to falter, to cry out, to abandon the effort. He did none of these. "My lady," he called over the roar of the storm, "we need to stabilize the root matrices. The nanospore weave can't handle this alone." She descended into the garden, her claws sparking faintly against the metal floors, her wings whipping behind her as she moved. The heat radiating from her body was a living shield, a natural barrier against the arc currents that slashed through the bioluminescent foliage. Even the molten roses seemed to pulse in response to her presence, as if acknowledging her dominion, but also trembling under the assault. "What do you need me to do?" she demanded, her voice cutting across the storm like a lance. "Hold the biofield node steady," he said, handing her two crystalline prisms that glowed with a soft inner light. "They need your fire to anchor them, or the roots will tear themselves apart under the stress." She took the nodes, feeling the hum of energy vibrating through her scales, and positioned herself at the heart of the garden. Elias worked around her, moving from root to root, placing microstabilizers and recalibrating the nanospore patterns. His hands moved with the certainty of someone who had spent years coaxing life from barren worlds. For all her centuries, she had never witnessed devotion like this, human, fragile, and utterly fearless. The storm intensified, sending arcs of raw energy crashing into the garden floor. Sparks flew, mingling with the bioluminescent glow of the roses, creating a surreal, almost apocalyptic display. One strike hit a cluster of her oldest blooms, sending a pulse of destructive heat through their roots. Elias dove without hesitation, shielding the plants with his body, adjusting the stabilizers even as his coat smoldered from the electrical backlash. She felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something tight and sharp in her chest, seeing this human risk himself for fragile life that was not his own. "Are you insane?" she shouted over the roar, her voice carrying both fury and awe. "I am alive," he said, voice strained but calm, "because I can choose to protect what matters. Fire alone does not choose." She reached him just as the roots began to writhe in distress, the nanospore weave fraying at the edges of its command. Together, they reinforced the lattice, her fire stabilizing the energy while his delicate adjustments healed the fractures. The garden trembled under the storm's force, yet it did not break. When the tempest finally passed, leaving a faint electric smell and a heavy silence, she found Elias kneeling amid the damp, scorched soil, his coat singed, his hands blistered. The roses had survived, some leaves torn, petals curled, but alive. A faint green luminescence shimmered through their veins, stronger now than before, as though the storm had awakened something deeper within them. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice low, carrying the weight of centuries. "I could have," he replied, straightening with a faint grin. "But they needed me. She studied him, the storm-swept hair plastered to his face, the cuts and burns marking his skin like badges of defiance. She realized that she had expected him to falter, to show fear, yet he had stood firm where dragons of her lineage would have faltered. It was not strength born of flame but of resolve, a fragile human determination that burned hotter than any ember she had ever known. For a long while, they remained silent, surveying the garden. Even the air seemed to hum with the residual energy of the storm and the healing nanospore weaves. The roses glimmered softly, their light steady and warm, no longer flickering in fear of destruction. "I never imagined a human could understand what the garden needs," she admitted finally, her voice almost a whisper. "Neither did I," he said, his hands brushing the soil, coaxing it back into rhythm. "But living things, they respond to care. Not fear. Not force. Care." The words lingered in the charged air. For centuries, she had ruled with power and fire, shaping the skies and the lands below with precision and dominance. Yet here, in the aftermath of the storm, she felt the fragile truth of what he said. Life did not bend to command, it needed patience, attention, and trust. When she finally turned to leave, she found herself reluctant. The storm had passed, yet a different kind of current ran through the garden now, subtle, electric, and full of promise. She realized that the human had not only stabilized her plants, he had introduced something new into the rhythm of the garden itself. "You have done well," she said, almost grudgingly, her molten eyes reflecting the bioluminescent glow. He looked up at her, a faint smirk playing at his lips, though exhaustion shadowed his face. "We've only begun," he said. She did not respond, only watched him work a while longer, feeling the pulse of life beneath her feet. Deep within the heart of the garden, where roots tangled with biometal and nanospore weaves hummed their quiet song, something else had awakened, a latent rhythm that neither dragonfire nor human hands had created alone. And in that quiet hum, Cerethes felt the first stirring of a thought she had long abandoned: perhaps life could endure even where flame failed. Weeks passed, and the garden no longer resembled the fragile collection of dying blossoms Cerethes had once ruled. Under Elias's hands, it had become something entirely new, a synthesis of dragon fire, human ingenuity, and the unpredictable will of life itself. Vines threaded with bioluminescent circuitry climbed the walls and balconies, pulsing faintly with a rhythm neither wholly mechanical nor entirely organic. The molten roses had matured into crystalline forms, their petals flexible yet firm, each vein glowing with traces of both fire and nanospore energy. The garden breathed as one organism now, responding to temperature, humidity, and the faintest shift in the magnetic field above the citadel. Cerethes walked among the rows of hybrid flora, her presence commanding, yet tempered by a cautious curiosity. She had spent centuries asserting her dominion over life with fire alone, and now she felt something unfamiliar, a sense of humility, watching this human coax existence from the impossible. Elias moved ahead of her, bending to adjust the weave of a root cluster that pulsed in turquoise light. "The old ways were too rigid," he said without looking up, his fingers tracing invisible circuits in the air above a plant. "Fire gives energy, but it does not guide. It consumes. Life needs direction, but not domination." She tilted her head, considering his words. Dragons had ruled through flame and instinct, through fear and awe, and yet the garden had survived only because of care that was not instinctual but learned, deliberate. She realized she had spent her life commanding what should have been nurtured. "I never thought it could thrive without fire," she admitted, her voice low, almost unsteady. "Not thrive without it," Elias corrected gently, "but thrive with it restrained. Controlled. Shared." They reached the center of the garden, where a large circular chamber had begun to form beneath the roots, a dome of translucent biometal that pulsed with the same light as the flowers above. Inside, the nanospore weave had begun constructing delicate filaments, forming structures that resembled small cradles or nests, faintly warm to the touch. Elias paused, running a hand over the lattice. "This is where the first hybrid growth will stabilize," he said. It's not a human child, not a dragon hatchling. But it's life. A fusion. Something new. She stepped closer, feeling the warmth radiating from the chamber. A part of her recoiled at the audacity of it. Dragons had never experimented with blending their essence with humans. It was forbidden, unimaginable. Yet another part of her, long buried beneath centuries of isolation and disappointment, felt a spark she had not dared feel before: hope. "You mean to say," she murmured, "that you are creating life here, from both our essences?" "Not from us," Elias said carefully. "From the energy we bring, the guidance we provide, the environment we create. Life always chooses its own form, Lady Cerethes. We only give it the conditions to survive." She studied him, sensing the sincerity that radiated from his small, unarmored frame. Humans were fragile, yes, but their determination was something dragons rarely understood, an insistence to endure despite weakness, to build rather than dominate. A hum rose beneath their feet, a subtle vibration in the biometal floor. The chamber pulsed with light, and faint shapes began to stir within the lattice, delicate, almost transparent forms that quivered as if testing the air. Cerethes's molten eyes widened. The forms were neither fully dragon nor human, but a strange synthesis that radiated life in its purest form. "They're responding to us," Elias whispered. "The garden recognizes our energy, our intent. It is learning to sustain them." For a long moment, she stood silently, feeling the pulse of the chamber echo through her chest. The sensation was unlike any she had experienced before, neither the thrill of power nor the heat of flame, but something quieter, insistent, and profoundly alive. She realized that this hybrid growth, fragile as it was, carried with it more than survival. It carried promise, the first true sign that life could persist even beyond the limits of blood and inheritance. "The council will not approve," she said finally, her voice almost bitter. "They will call this heresy. They will try to destroy it." Elias straightened, his gaze steady. "Then we defend it. Life doesn't wait for permission." Her wings twitched, reflexive tension coiling along her spine. She had faced storms, wars, and the slow decay of her lineage, but now she felt the gravity of what they had created together, a fragile hope in a world that had almost forgotten the meaning of hope. Days turned into nights and back again, the biometal lattice expanding with the patient precision of Elias's adjustments and the unpredictable vitality of her fire. Each new filament, each pulse of light, seemed to teach the garden more, shaping the chamber into a protective nest that could sustain growth beyond what dragons or humans had ever achieved alone. Cerethes watched the hybrid forms closely. They were not conscious, not yet, but the faint vibrations in their structure suggested a primitive awareness, a sensitivity to touch and warmth. She reached out tentatively, her clawed fingers hovering above one of the delicate forms. A subtle reaction met her hand, a tremor, a pulse that mirrored her own heartbeat. Elias's voice came softly from beside her. "It recognizes life, not power. That is its instinct." She nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. Power alone had ended her line. Control alone had starved her garden. But this careful guidance, this shared energy, could foster a future that neither species could achieve alone. For the first time in centuries, Cerethes allowed herself to imagine a life that extended beyond her own mortality. She could envision the garden thriving long after the citadel itself fell, a sanctuary where fire and flesh, human and dragon, could coexist and give rise to something neither could predict. As the lights of the chamber pulsed beneath the roots, she realized that she had begun to feel something deeper than curiosity or fascination. For the first time in her existence, she felt connected, not just to the garden, not just to Elias, but to the fragile, radiant possibility of a future yet unshaped. And somewhere, deep within the lattice, the first signs of awareness began to flicker in response to her presence, as if life itself were learning to listen, and to hope. The council arrived without warning, their ship slicing through the clouds like jagged shards of obsidian. Varenth trembled beneath the weight of their engines, and the hum of the city's suspension system stuttered in protest. Lady Cerethes felt the vibrations through her claws and wings before she heard the first comms broadcast. a chorus of imperious voices demanding the garden be surrendered for inspection and preservation of lineage integrity. They did not see the garden for what it had become, a living entity, responsive and defiant, pulsing with a new kind of life that no decree could contain. Elias stood among the hybrid blossoms, his hands adjusting nanospore weaves even as the metallic roar of the council ships pierced the upper atmosphere. He did not flinch, though the wind whipped through the arboretum, scattering petals that glimmered with bioluminescent light. "They will not understand," he said softly, almost to himself. "They see only threats to control." Cerethes descended from her balcony, wings fully extended, heat radiating in controlled pulses across the garden. "Then we show them," she said. Her voice carried not fear, but the ancient authority of her bloodline, tempered now by something Elias had helped her rediscover, patience, and understanding of life beyond command. The council enforcers breached the outer gates with plasma lances and gravity suppressors, their forms sleek in reflective armor designed to intimidate and subdue. They expected resistance born of fear, perhaps flight. Instead, they encountered a garden alive in its own defiance. Vines lifted themselves as though in warning, thorns sharpened with crystalline edges glinting under the erratic light, and the biometal lattice pulsed in sync with Elias's movements. It was a symphony of life and energy, precise and dangerous. One of the enforcers stepped forward, raising a hand in ritualized authority. "Step aside, Lady Cerethes. Your creations violate the Emberline's covenant. Surrender the chamber, or we will destroy it." Cerethes's eyes narrowed, molten amber catching the flashes of weaponized plasma. She spread her wings and let her heat flare in a controlled arc, melting the tips of the nearest lances. "You threaten what you cannot comprehend," she said. "These lives are not yours to judge." Elias moved beside her, activating the protective resonance of the hybrid lattice. The chamber beneath the roots began to pulse, subtle vibrations rolling outward, forming a field that interfered with the enforcer's sensors. Their suits emitted high-pitched alerts, and several staggered back as if struck by invisible force. "They will have to come through me first," he said quietly, setting his stance among the intertwining roots. The battle began not with fire alone, but with an orchestrated clash of living systems. The vines moved with purpose, ensnaring weapons, rerouting energy, and creating barriers that shimmered with bioluminescence. The roses, once fragile, projected heat fields calibrated by Elias's nanospore weaves, forcing the enforcers to rethink every step. Plasma arcs struck the walls and floors, but the garden absorbed and redirected the energy, channels of biometal thrumming in harmonic resonance. Cerethes unleashed controlled bursts of flame, not to destroy, but to reinforce the lattice, guiding the hybrid forms in a coordinated defense. Despite the chaos, her attention kept returning to the chamber. The hybrid lifeforms inside trembled and pulsed, their collective awareness flickering as they adjusted to the assault. Elias's hands flew over the control nodes, synchronizing the energy of the garden with the pulse of the forms. Slowly, the chamber itself began to react, sending tendrils of protective light upward, weaving between the vines and the roses, forming a cocoon of biometal and luminescence. The enforcers attempted to advance, but every step forward was met with resistance. Roots constricted like living steel cables, while thorn branches redirected energy pulses back at their armor. One officer fell back, igniting the ground beneath him as his suit overloaded. Another fired indiscriminately, but the plasma dissolved harmlessly against the garden's reactive filaments. Amid the chaos, Cerethes felt a surge within herself, a resonance she had not anticipated. The chamber beneath the roots pulsed in harmony with her heartbeat. The hybrid forms were responding, not just defensively, but actively, learning the rhythm of threat and protection. A shiver of realization ran through her, the garden was no longer only a sanctuary. It was alive, sentient in ways she had never intended, capable of strategy, instinct, and perhaps even loyalty. Elias's voice cut through the tumult. "It's working. They're listening to us, moving with us." She allowed herself a brief smile, molten heat flaring in controlled arcs around her form. The enforcers paused, uncertainty flickering across their visors. Their training, their instruments, their authority, all were proving inadequate against a garden that refused to be conquered. The battle reached its apex when a concentrated strike of plasma tore through a section of the chamber's outer lattice. Elias dove, hands pressing against the broken nodes, directing the pulse of the garden into a defensive surge. Cerethes followed, unleashing a torrent of flame precisely calibrated to reinforce the structure rather than destroy it. Light and heat cascaded through the chamber, stabilizing the hybrid forms and repelling the enforcers in a wave of combined energy. When the dust and residual currents settled, the citadel hung in uneasy silence. The enforcers had been forced into retreat, their plasma weapons fizzling, some of their armor irreparably damaged. The garden stood intact, glowing with quiet resilience, the hybrid forms inside pulsing rhythmically, as if acknowledging victory and survival. Cerethes lowered her wings, the molten glow in her eyes dimming to a contemplative amber. Elias straightened beside her, grime and scorch marks on his coat, but unbowed. Around them, the garden breathed, alive in a new, deliberate rhythm that neither dragonfire nor human hands could claim alone. "They will not leave us in peace," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the council ships had disappeared into the clouds. "No," Elias agreed. "But neither will we surrender. Not now. Not ever." A new energy pulsed beneath the biometal roots, a subtle resonance that hummed in harmony with their combined presence. Life had survived, adapted, and learned. And in the quiet pulse of the chamber, Cerethes realized that this was more than victory, it was the birth of a future that neither species could have imagined, a legacy that would endure far beyond the councils, the storms, and even the fire of dragons. Years had passed since the battle that had nearly claimed the citadel. The council's enforcers never returned, their defeat and the resilience of the garden whispered across Varanth as cautionary legend. The floating city itself had shifted subtly in that time, stabilized not only by engines and metal but by the life that now pulsed through every floor, balcony, and root-laden chamber. The garden had become the heart of the citadel, a living ecosystem of hybrid flora that radiated warmth, light, and an almost imperceptible awareness. Travelers from distant colonies spoke of the citadel as a place where the impossible thrived, a fusion of fire and care, dragon and human, creating something new and enduring. Cerethes moved through the garden as she had not in decades, unhurried, unguarded, her wings folding lightly behind her. Where once she had felt emptiness and despair, she now sensed connection, the quiet pulse of life around her resonating with her own. The hybrid forms, once fragile embryos of possibility, had matured into luminous beings, their translucent shapes tracing the latticework of biometal like delicate constellations. They were neither fully dragon nor human, but something beyond either species, a living testament to what patience, care, and collaboration could achieve. Elias stood near the center of the chamber, now expanded to occupy nearly half the garden. He was older, his hands still nimble, his hair streaked with silver, but his eyes retained the same calm determination that had first brought him to her garden. He was kneeling beside a cluster of the hybrids, guiding their growth with subtle pulses of nanospore energy that intertwined with Cerethes' own controlled warmth. Together, they moved in harmony, a duet of fire and technique, teaching the new life to flourish. "You have done more than I imagined," Cerethes said softly, watching one of the hybrids respond to his touch, coiling and stretching with awareness. "They listen to you. To us. They've grown into something magnificent." Elias looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. "They've grown because you let them. Because you allowed care to guide what fire alone could not." For the first time, Cerethes considered the years of isolation and command, the loneliness of being the last of her line. The grief that had weighed on her for centuries seemed distant now, replaced with a quiet fulfillment that she had not believed possible. These beings, born from the combination of human ingenuity and dragon essence, were not simply children or heirs, they were legacy incarnate. They carried within them the memory of the Ember Line, the touch of the human hand, and the possibility of a future unbound by old limitations. Beyond the garden, the lower continents had begun to hear of the citadel's transformation. Humans and dragons, once divided by fear and hierarchy, now spoke in whispers of the sanctuary above the clouds, a place where coexistence and hybrid creation had proven possible. Scholars and explorers arrived cautiously at first, studying the garden from a distance, measuring its pulse, charting its light and energy. None could replicate it. The secret lay not in science alone, nor in fire alone, but in the delicate balance between two wills willing to nurture life together. One of the hybrid beings curled around Cerethi's clawed fingers, emitting a gentle hum that resonated with her heartbeat. She allowed herself to smile, molten warmth threading through her scales without consuming them. Elias knelt beside her, placing a hand over hers, the human pulse steady against the rhythmic vibration of the living lattice beneath them. "It seems," he said softly, "that the garden itself has chosen to survive with us, not despite us." Cerethes nodded, feeling the truth of his words. The chamber beneath the roots glowed brighter, sending threads of light upward through the vines and roses, connecting every corner of the garden in a web of living consciousness. It was a chorus of existence that carried memory, adaptation, and intent. The hybrids, responding to that energy, extended outward, exploring the garden, learning to move and interact, forming bonds among themselves and with their creators. For the first time, she allowed herself to envision a future in which she was no longer defined by the inability to produce heirs. The garden itself was her heir, a living testament to what could emerge when creation was guided by patience, love, and shared purpose. No counsel, no ancient law, no prophecy could negate the life thriving before her. Elias released a faint stream of nanospore light, sending it toward one of the hybrids, which shimmered and arched in response. "We've done more than preserve life," he said. "We've given it a chance to shape its own destiny." Cerethes turned her molten gaze to him, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with fire. "I never believed I could feel hope again," she admitted. "And now, it seems I cannot imagine my life without it." Together, they walked through the garden, their shadows stretching over roots and petals that glowed in the light of their combined presence. The hybrids followed, moving with a graceful awareness, testing the limits of their forms, stretching their consciousness into the lattice of life around them. Outside the citadel, the clouds shifted in response to subtle currents, as though the skies themselves acknowledged the balance that had been achieved within the floating city. In the distance, travelers approaching Varanth could see the faint shimmer of bioluminescence through the stormlit clouds, the pulse of life that refused to be contained. Legends would speak of the dragon and the human who defied extinction, who nurtured life that was neither wholly one nor the other, but something entirely new. And in those whispers, across the continents and the skies, the story of fire and care, of patient hands and molten wings, would endure. Cerethes paused beside the chamber, watching a hybrid extend a delicate, crystalline limb toward the horizon. "I cannot have children," she murmured, echoing the truth she had long carried alone. Elias smiled, placing a hand over hers, feeling the pulse of life beneath. "You have more than enough," he said simply. "For both of us, and for everyone who will come after." Above the citadel, the clouds parted, revealing the stars beyond, distant suns casting their light across the floating city. The garden pulsed with quiet radiance, a heartbeat that echoed across species, time, and expectation. In that moment, Lady Cerethes understood the deepest truth of creation: life, once guided with care, could endure far beyond the limitations of any single being. And for the first time in centuries, the ember line was not ending. It was beginning again.